Could you imagine watching death approach your neighbors, knowing they built exactly the way they were supposed to, and that's precisely why they're about to die? What if everything you knew about building a home was backwards? What if the wisdom passed down through generations, the building techniques in every manual, the methods every experienced carpenter swore by, would get you killed? What would you do if you had 8 minutes to prove that tradition itself was the enemy? Could you convince people to abandon everything they believed about shelter when the sky turned green and the wind started coming from the wrong direction? Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. This is what we do here. We dig up the frontier stories that got buried or forgotten. This story is about a man who learned that survival on the American prairie meant unlearning everything his father taught him, and learning from the people settlers were displacing. If that kind of story interests you, hit subscribe. We've got a lot more of them. And seriously, drop a comment about frontier building techniques or native survival knowledge. We love hearing what you're into. Now, let's go to Missouri, 1853, where Thomas Brennan is standing on his porch watching a tornado approach, knowing exactly who's about to die and why.
The tornado was still 5 miles out when Thomas Brennan realized his neighbors were going to die. He could see their cabins from his front porch, 7 structures dotting the Missouri prairie like children's toys arranged on a quilt. Every single one facing south, doors open to catch the afternoon breeze, windows gleaming in the strange green light that had turned the sky into something from a nightmare. The dark funnel cloud was approaching from the southwest, and Thomas understood with terrible clarity what was about to happen. His own cabin faced north. His neighbors had mocked that choice for 2 years. Some had called him touched. Others had suggested the sun had gotten to him during the journey west. John Hackett had openly laughed, slapping his knee and saying Thomas must have built his cabin backwards by mistake and was too proud to admit it. In approximately 8 minutes, the difference between facing north and facing south would matter more than anything else in their lives. Those who'd built correctly would live. Those who'd followed tradition would die. And Thomas, standing on his porch watching death approach, knew there wasn't enough time to save them all. The wind had turned strange an hour earlier, not the steady prairie breeze that bent the grass in waves and made the whole landscape ripple like an ocean of green. This was something else, a restless, probing wind that came in gusts from different directions, as if the air itself couldn't decide which way to move. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. Thomas's skin prickled with static electricity. When he'd reached for the iron door handle 30 minutes ago, a spark had jumped from metal to flesh with enough force to make him yelp. His hair was standing up slightly, responding to the electrical charge building in the atmosphere. The air felt thick, pressed down like a wool blanket in summer heat, making it hard to draw a full breath. Thomas had grown up in Tennessee, where his father had built cabins the traditional way, door facing south for winter sun, windows positioned for cross-ventilation, roof pitched to shed snow and rain. Every frontier building manual recommended it. Every experienced carpenter followed the same principles. Every structure Thomas had ever seen, from Virginia to Kentucky to Tennessee to Missouri, had followed those rules without question. Thomas had followed them too, until the Osage elder named Three Hawks had asked him a simple question that unraveled everything he thought he knew about building. Do you build for the sun, or do you build for the wind? That conversation happened in the autumn of 1851, when Thomas was still clearing his land claim in what would become western Missouri. The land agent in Independence had assured him this was prime territory, good soil, adequate water, close enough to established settlements for trade, but far enough out to claim a generous parcel. What the land agent hadn't mentioned, or didn't know, or didn't care about was that this stretch of prairie sat in what the Osage called the pathway of angry spirits, a corridor where severe storms moved with terrifying regularity. Three Hawks had watched Thomas stake out his cabin site that September afternoon. The old man had appeared seemingly from nowhere, standing at the edge of the clearing without sound or warning. Thomas had been measuring solar angles with a compass and string, calculating where the winter sun would track across the sky, determining the optimal south-facing orientation for his door. His father had taught him this method, his grandfather before that. It was science, geometry, proven practice. Three Hawks had said nothing for a long time, just studied the land with eyes that seemed to see through time itself. He looked at the tree line, the way branches bent. He examined the grass patterns, how certain areas showed more wear than others. He crouched and ran his fingers through the soil, testing its composition. He walked to a small rise and stood there for 10 minutes, face turned to the southwest, as if listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. Finally, Three Hawks had spoken. His English was good, learned through decades of trade and increasingly unavoidable contact with white settlers. The sun is your friend 6 months of the year. The wind is your enemy 12 months of the year. Which do you build for? Thomas hadn't understood, not then. He'd built cabins before, helped his father construct 3 different homesteads across Tennessee and Kentucky. He'd studied the building guides his father treasured, books brought from Pennsylvania, printed wisdom from Philadelphia architects who'd never set foot west of the Alleghenies, but whose knowledge was considered gospel. South-facing was fundamental. The logic was unassailable. Winter sun streaming through south-facing windows provided free heat, less firewood needed, more comfortable living, lower risk of freeze death during brutal winters. It was simply how things were done, as natural and obvious as facing a house toward a road or placing a barn near a water source. But Three Hawks had been patient in a way that suggested he'd had this conversation before, probably many times, probably with many settlers who dismissed his advice and paid for it with their lives. He'd taken Thomas to 3 different spots on the prairie over the next week, always at dawn or dusk when the wind told its stories most clearly. He'd shown Thomas how to read the land like a book written in bent grass and shaped trees. The cottonwoods along the creek didn't grow straight. Every single one leaned northeast. Trunks curved like old men bending under heavy loads, twisted by decades of prevailing southwestern wind. The pattern was consistent. Young saplings, mature trees, ancient giants. All leaned the same direction. All bore the same mark of relentless force applied from the same direction year after year. The rock outcroppings showed similar evidence. Their southwestern faces were worn smooth, carved by wind-driven sand and rain into flowing curves like river stones. The northeastern faces were rough and jagged, protected from the worst erosion by the bulk of the rock itself. You could run your hand over the surfaces and feel the difference, smooth as glass on one side, rough as broken granite on the other. Even the prairie dog mounds clustered on the northeastern sides of small rises, tucked into whatever shelter the terrain offered. The animals weren't stupid. They'd learned over countless generations where to build for protection from the wind that scoured everything exposed. Three Hawks had pointed out dead trees that had fallen during storms. They all lay pointing northeast, pushed over by wind from the southwest. Old cabin sites, abandoned structures from earlier failed settlements, showed debris scattered in the same direction. A careful observer could read the prairie like a map of wind and force, with every element pointing toward the same relentless truth. The wind came from the southwest with power that could kill, and it came often enough to shape everything in its path. "Your people build for the season," Three Hawks had said, settling onto a rock and pulling out a pipe. "You think, winter is cold, I need sun, I face south. This is not wrong thinking, but it is incomplete thinking. Winter lasts 4 months, maybe 5. Wind lasts forever. Wind kills more than cold. Wind breaks what cold only threatens." He gestured across the prairie with his pipe stem. "See that grass? See how it bends? That grass has wisdom. It bends with wind. It does not fight. But grass cannot build houses. Houses must stand. So houses must be wise in different way. If house faces the wind with door, with windows, wind finds way inside. Once inside, wind is trapped animal, tries to get out, pushes on walls from inside. House explodes like too full water skin." Thomas had started to understand. "You're saying the door shouldn't face into the prevailing wind." "I am saying," Three Hawks replied, "that door facing wind is door asking to be torn off. House with big holes facing wind is house asking to be torn apart. Sun comes from south, yes, but wind comes from southwest. You must choose which to face, or you build 2 houses, one for sun, one for wind. Since you have wood for only 1 house, choose carefully." Over the following weeks, as Thomas prepared timber and gathered materials, Three Hawks had shared knowledge that represented centuries of accumulated observation. The Osage hadn't always lived on the prison, open prairie. Their territories had shifted over time, pushed by conflicts with other tribes, drawn by hunting opportunities, forced by European expansion. But wherever they'd lived, they'd studied the land with survival-focused intensity that European settlers rarely matched. Three Hawks explained that storms on the prairie followed patterns. Spring and early summer brought the worst tornado weather, warm, moist air from the Gulf meeting cold, dry air from the north, creating atmospheric instability that spawned rotating columns of wind capable of destroying anything in their path. These tornadoes almost invariably moved from southwest to northeast, following the track of the thunderstorms that birthed them. "We build lodges that can be left behind when spirits walk," Three Hawks said. "We move our families away from danger. Your people build houses that cannot move. So house must be built to survive when family cannot flee. This requires different thinking." He'd shown Thomas how to observe storm approaches. The greenish color of the sky wasn't random. It indicated severe hail suspended in the thunderstorm, ice particles catching sunlight in a way that created that distinctive, terrifying hue. The absolute calm before a tornado, the eerie stillness when wind suddenly stopped, indicated the storm's updraft was so powerful it was pulling air from all directions into its center. The roar everyone described wasn't wind noise exactly. It was the sound of hundreds of objects being torn apart simultaneously, mixed with the freight train thunder of air moving at incredible speeds. Thomas had listened. More importantly, he'd believed. That belief separated him from most of his neighbors who heard similar warnings from indigenous people and dismissed them as superstition or primitive fear. Thomas had spent his first winter in Missouri paying attention. He'd watched what happened when storms hit. He'd found the remains of the previous homesteader's cabin 2 miles from his claim, nothing left but foundation stones and timber scattered in a northeastward debris field that stretched for a 1/4 mile. When spring came and he began construction, Thomas built his cabin facing north. The decision was deliberate and calculated. The door, the primary opening and the greatest structural weakness, faced away from the prevailing southwestern winds. The south wall, the wall that would bear the brunt of the most severe storms, had only 2 small windows positioned high near the roof line and protected by deep eaves. Every design choice prioritized wind resistance over traditional architectural principles. His neighbors thought he was insane. John Hackett, whose claim bordered Thomas's to the south, had been the most vocal critic. Hackett was a man who believed in tradition, in proven methods, in doing things the way they'd always been done because that's what worked. He'd built a beautiful cabin, picture-perfect with its south-facing front, welcoming, porch that caught afternoon sun, large windows on the south and west walls to maximize light and ventilation. "You're building backwards," Hackett had told Thomas in the summer of 1852, watching Thomas frame the north-facing door with reinforced timber posts. "You'll freeze to death come winter, mark my words. Dark as a cave in there, no sun getting in. What kind of fool builds a house facing away from the light?" "The kind who wants to live through next spring," Thomas had replied, but he'd said it quietly. You didn't win arguments by making your neighbors feel stupid, especially when those neighbors might be the only help available in emergencies. Hackett had laughed, a big booming sound that carried across the prairie. "Spring? Son, spring's got nothing to do with how you orient a cabin. Winter'll kill you long before spring. You need that south sun. Everybody knows that. Building different don't make you smart, makes you stubborn." But Thomas had continued with his unconventional design. The structural reinforcement went far beyond what was typical for frontier cabins. Three Hawks had taught him bracing patterns that European carpentry didn't use, diagonal members connecting roof frames directly to foundation sills, creating a structural cage that distributed wind loads across multiple connection points rather than relying on a few critical joints that would fail under extreme stress. The roof pitch was carefully calculated, not the steep pitch you'd see in snowy regions where heavy snow loads required sharp angles for shedding, not the shallow pitch of southern climates where rain was the primary concern. Thomas's roof sat at approximately 30 degrees, an angle Three Hawks had demonstrated using sticks and cord, an angle refined through generations of observation about how wind flowed over surfaces. Too flat, wind pushes down, tries to crush, Three Hawks had explained. Too steep, wind catches like sail, tries to lift. Middle angle, wind flows over like water over stone. Still pushes, but pushes less. Every small help is help. The door itself was engineered in ways his neighbors couldn't see and wouldn't have understood if explained. Most cabin doors were simple affairs, thick planks held together with crossbeams, hung on leather or iron hinges, secured with a wooden bar on the inside. They were designed to keep out animals, cold, and possibly hostile humans. They weren't designed to resist extreme wind pressure from both directions simultaneously. Thomas's door was 3 inches thick, made from planks cut from the heart of oak logs, fitted so tightly together that light couldn't pass between them. But the real engineering was in the frame and hinges. The door frame was let into the wall logs, notched and pinned so it couldn't be torn free without destroying the entire wall section. The hinges were heavy iron straps that extended 18 inches into the wall structure through multiple log courses, creating connections that would require catastrophic structural failure to break. And critically, the door was braced to resist pressure from inside the cabin as much as from outside. This seemed backwards to anyone who examined it. Why would you need to prevent a door from opening from the inside? The answer was physics that most frontier builders didn't understand. When extreme wind found its way into a structure through any opening, a broken window, a crack in the chinking, any penetration in the building envelope, it increased internal pressure. That pressure sought escape. The door, designed to resist external pressure but not internal, would blow outward. Once the door blew out, the entire structure would likely fail, unable to withstand the combination of external wind pressure and internal pressure trying to explode the cabin apart. Three Hawks had explained it with hand gestures and the patience of someone teaching a crucial survival skill. Wind gets inside through small hole. Now wind is trapped, pushes on all walls from inside. Door is weakest point. Door blows out like cork from bottle. Then walls follow, then roof. House falls inside out. He demonstrated with a rawhide bag, blowing air in through a small hole, then showing how the entire bag distended and burst. Door must hold both ways or house dies. The window placement on Thomas's cabin told a story of deliberate calculation. The 2 windows on the south wall, the wall facing the most dangerous storms, were small, measuring barely 18 inches square, positioned 7 feet above the floor just below the roof line. This high placement minimized the opening size that wind could exploit while still allowing light and some ventilation. The deep eaves that extended out from the roof line created protective overhangs, deflecting wind and rain away from the window openings. The windows on the north wall, protected from prevailing winds, were larger and lower, proper windows for daily living, for seeing out across the prairie, for ventilation during calm weather. The contrast was stark. Anyone walking around Thomas's cabin could see immediately that it wasn't symmetrical, wasn't balanced, didn't follow aesthetic principles that governed traditional architecture. It looked wrong, unfinished somehow, as if the builder had run out of windows halfway through and decided to just put small ones on one side and large ones on the other. But every asymmetry had a reason. The west wall, the wall that would face the storm's initial approach, had no windows at all. 0. Just solid log construction with tiny rifle ports, narrow slots that could be quickly plugged but wouldn't allow significant wind penetration even if left open. When neighbors asked about this, Thomas explained that he valued wall space for interior furnishings more than western light. The real reason was that every opening was a potential failure point, and the western wall needed to be as close to impenetrable as possible. The foundation work revealed similar obsessive attention to wind resistance. Standard frontier cabin construction placed logs directly on the ground or on minimal stone foundations. The cabin's weight kept it in place. For normal weather, this was adequate. The structure wasn't going anywhere. but tornado-force winds could generate uplift that exceeded the weight of a small cabin. Thomas had seen evidence of this in the scattered debris from previous failed structures, foundation logs still in place, the rest of the building gone, as if some giant hand had simply lifted the cabin off its base and flung it away. So Thomas had dug foundation trenches 2 feet deep, filled them with carefully selected and fitted stones, and anchored his sill logs with iron spikes driven through the wood deep into the rock foundation. Each spike was 18 inches long, driven at angles to create mechanical interlocking that couldn't pull free without shattering either the wood or the stone. The iron was expensive. Purchasing it had consumed nearly a quarter of Thomas's cash reserves. But Three Hawks had been emphatic. "Wind will lift your house like leaf if you do not nail it to earth. Iron is expensive. Death is more expensive." The chinking between logs showed similar attention to detail that varied by wall exposure. The south and west walls, exposed to the harshest weather and strongest winds, had chinking that extended slightly beyond the log faces, creating a rough texture that disrupted smooth airflow over the surface. The chinking mixture itself was different, not just mud and moss, but a combination of clay, lime, sand, and horsehair that Three Hawks had taught him to prepare. The lime made it set hard. The sand gave it body. The horsehair reinforced it against cracking. The result was chinking that was more like mortar than mud, creating semi-rigid connections between logs rather than just filling gaps. The north and east walls had chinking set flush or slightly recessed, creating smoother surfaces. This seemed backward. Shouldn't the exposed walls have the best chinking? But Three Hawks had explained. Rough surfaces on the windward side disrupted airflow, reducing the efficiency with which wind could push against the structure. Smooth surfaces on the leeward side minimized turbulence and eddy currents that could create problematic suction effects. By May 1853, Thomas's cabin had been standing for nearly a year. It had weathered several severe storms, including one February blizzard that had lasted 3 days and buried the prairie under 4 feet of snow, and a March windstorm with straight-line gusts estimated at 70 miles per hour that had torn shingles from John Hackett's roof and collapsed Samuel Morrow's shed. Thomas's cabin had suffered no damage, not even minor damage. The snow had piled against the north wall, but the cabin's orientation meant the wind wasn't driving snow against the door. The March windstorm had howled around the structure, but with no large openings on the windward sides, the wind had nothing to grab. It had simply flowed around and over, seeking easier prey. The skepticism about Thomas's backwards cabin had softened somewhat. Men who'd had to repair storm damage in March had noticed that Thomas was still living in an undamaged structure. But old beliefs died hard, and most neighbors attributed Thomas's success to luck rather than design. Cabins faced south. That was tradition. That was how things were done. One cabin surviving one winter didn't prove anything. The afternoon of May 17, 1853, started ordinary enough. Thomas was working in his cornfield, about 40 acres he'd cleared and planted, the young stalks just starting to show real growth. His wife Sarah was in the vegetable garden closer to the cabin, weeding between rows of beans and squash. Their 2 children, 9-year-old Michael and 6-year-old Am, were supposed to be doing chores but had likely snuck off to the creek to look for crawfish. Thomas made a mental note to check on them in another hour. The temperature was warm, probably mid-80s, and the humidity was oppressive. Thomas's shirt was soaked with sweat before noon. The air felt thick, difficult to breathe, as if the atmosphere had gained weight. By mid-afternoon, his skin was prickling with what felt like dozens of tiny insect bites, though when he checked, there were no insects. Just static electricity building to levels that made his hair stand slightly away from his head and caused sparks when he touched metal. Then he noticed the sky. It was changing color in the west, taking on a hue that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Not the gray of normal storm clouds, not even the dark purple-black of severe thunderstorms. This was a greenish-yellow color, sickly and unnatural, like old bruises or infected flesh. Thomas had seen that color once before, in Tennessee when he was 12, right before a tornado had torn through a neighboring county and killed 17 people. He dropped his hoe where he stood and stared west. The color was spreading, covering the western horizon like a disease. Then he felt it, the wind dying, not diminishing gradually, but stopping completely. One moment there was the constant prairie breeze that had been present every day since he had arrived in Missouri. The next moment, absolute stillness. Nothing moving, not grass, not leaves, not even dust. The silence was profound and terrifying. Thomas ran. He ran toward the cabin, shouting for Sarah. "Get the children! Get them inside, now! Storm coming!" Sarah had already seen the sky. She was running toward the creek, calling for Michael and Anne, her voice sharp with urgency. The children, hearing their mother's tone, abandoned whatever mischief they'd been engaged in and came running. "Inside!" Thomas yelled, pointing at the cabin. "Get in the northwest corner, away from the windows!" Sarah didn't question, didn't hesitate. She grabbed Anne's hand and sprinted for the cabin, Michael running ahead. Thomas made one stop, the barn. He threw open the doors and drove out their 2 horses and 4 pigs with shouts and slaps. The animals, already nervous from the atmospheric conditions, bolted immediately, running northeast away from the approaching storm. Thomas didn't try to catch them. Animals had instincts humans had bred out of themselves. Let them run. They'd come back or they wouldn't, but at least they wouldn't be trapped in a structure that might collapse. Then he was inside the cabin, slamming the heavy door and dropping the reinforced bar into its brackets. Sarah had the children in the northwest corner, the most protected spot, away from the south wall that would face the storm, away from the door tucked under the strongest part of the roof structure where diagonal bracing created a protective cage. "What's happening?" Michael asked, trying to sound brave, but fear making his voice shake. "Storm," Thomas said, moving to one of the small south-facing windows to look out. "Bad one, like the one that hit Tennessee when I was young." "Will we be safe?" Anne was crying now, picking up on the terror in her parents' voices despite their attempts to stay calm. Thomas wanted to say yes with absolute certainty, wanted to promise his daughter that nothing would hurt them. But he'd learned in his 27 years that lying to children about danger didn't protect them, it just made them unprepared when the lie proved false. "The cabin is built strong," he said instead. "We should be safe if we stay where we are, but it's going to be loud and frightening. The wind will sound like nothing you've heard before. The cabin will shake, but it's designed for this. 3 Hawks taught me how to build for wind. Trust the cabin." Sarah met his eyes across the dim interior. She was terrified. He could see it in her face, but she was also strong. She'd grown up on the frontier, too, had survived hardships that would break softer people. She pulled both children close, wrapping them in her arms, and nodded at Thomas. "We'll survive this. We have to." The wind returned, but it didn't build gradually like normal storms. One moment there was dead calm. The next, there was a roar like the end of the world. It hit like a physical force, like a giant invisible hand slamming into the cabin. The entire structure shuddered. Dust rained down from between the logs. The windows rattled so hard, Thomas thought the glass would shatter. He stayed at the south window, looking out, though Sarah shouted at him to get away from the glass. He needed to see, needed to understand what was coming. What he saw made his stomach turn to ice water. The tornado was a black column against the green-yellow sky, perhaps a quarter-mile wide at its base, extending up until it disappeared into the cloud deck miles overhead. It was moving northeast, directly toward the line of settlements, and it was already destroying everything in its path. Thomas watched John Hackett's cabin die. The structure sat about half a mile southwest of Thomas's place, far enough for perspective, close enough to see details. The cabin looked solid from a distance, well-built, traditional, exactly what any experienced carpenter would construct. Door facing south, porch facing south, large windows on the south and west walls to catch light and air. The tornado hit it almost head-on. For perhaps 3 seconds, the cabin seemed to hold. Then the south wall, the wall with the door and large windows, buckled inward under incredible wind pressure. But it was what happened next that revealed the true physics of tornado destruction. The wind, finding its way through the suddenly compromised south wall, flooded into the interior of the cabin. The internal pressure spiked instantly. The door, designed to resist pressure from outside but not from inside, blew outward so violently that Thomas could not see it tumbling through the air even at a half-mile distance. With the door gone, the pressure inside had an escape route, and the entire cabin exploded outward like a grenade. The walls bowed out, the roof lifted, and then the whole structure came apart in an expanding cloud of spinning timber. It happened in less than 5 seconds. One moment a cabin stood there, the next moment there was nothing but a debris field of shattered wood and scattered belongings spinning in the black funnel. Thomas's throat closed. John Hackett had a wife, Margaret, 3 children, the youngest barely 2 years old. Where were they? In the cabin when it exploded? Already dead? Thrown clear but injured? There was no way to know, no way to see through the debris cloud, no way to help even if he could see. The tornado moved on. The Morrow cabin was next, slightly closer to Thomas's position, maybe a quarter mile now. Samuel Morrow had 4 children under 10. His wife Eliza had been pregnant when Thomas last saw her, probably 7 months along by now. Thomas had helped Samuel build that cabin the previous year, had argued unsuccessfully about orientation. Samuel had been polite but firm. He appreciated Thomas's concern, but he knew how to build a cabin, and it faced south because that's how cabins were built. Samuel was from Pennsylvania, from a family of builders, and Pennsylvania builders knew their craft. The tornado hit the Morrow place at an angle, not the direct strike that had destroyed Hackett's cabin. For a moment, Thomas thought it might survive. The cabin was well built, good timber, solid joinery, but it had the same fatal flaw: large openings facing southwest. The southwest corner of the cabin took the first impact. Thomas saw the wall bow inward, saw the corner joints separate. Then the wind found the windows. The glass shattered. Thomas couldn't hear it over the roar, but he saw the windows explode outward, which meant wind pressure inside was higher than outside. The door held for maybe 2 seconds longer, then it too blew out. But the Morrow cabin didn't explode like Hackett's had. Instead, it folded. The south wall collapsed inward, the roof tilted crazily, and the whole structure crushed down on itself like a kicked anthill. Possibly worse than exploding. If the family was inside, they were now buried under tons of collapsed logs and roofing. Thomas couldn't watch anymore. He turned away from the window, his face bloodless. Sarah was staring at him, children pressed against her, everyone frozen in terror. "They're gone," Thomas said, his voice barely audible over the roar that was getting closer, louder. "Hackett's gone. Morrow's collapsed. The tornado's coming right at us." Michael made a sound, half sob, half whimper. Anne was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Sarah's jaw was clenched so hard, Thomas could see muscles standing out in her neck. But she didn't scream, didn't panic. She just held the children tighter and stared at her husband. "The cabin will hold," Thomas said, but he wasn't sure if he was reassuring his family or himself. "It's built for this. Three Hawks knew. The cabin will hold." The sound was beyond description now. Not just roaring, that word was inadequate. It was like standing next to a waterfall, a locomotive, an avalanche, and a dozen simultaneous lightning strikes, all combined and amplified until it became a physical force that pressed on eardrums and vibrated in bone marrow. The cabin was shaking continuously, a rapid trembling like an animal shivering in cold. Then the impact came. The tornado didn't hit them dead on like it had hit Hackett's place. If it had, even Thomas's reinforced cabin might have failed. Instead, the edge of the funnel clipped them, the outer winds, still over 100 miles per hour, slamming into the structure with incredible force. The entire cabin shifted. Thomas felt it move on its foundation, sliding sideways maybe an inch before. The foundation anchors caught and held. The sound of iron spikes grinding against stone was audible even over the roar. The cabin shuddered, settled, held. The south wall bowed inward. Thomas could see the logs flexing, the wall curving inward under the pressure of wind pushing with force that would have collapsed a lesser structure. But the diagonal bracing Three Hawks had taught him prevented catastrophic failure. The braces connecting the wall to the roof structure and down to the foundation distributed the load. The wall bowed but didn't break. The roof lifted. Thomas could see daylight appear between the top log of the south wall and the roof structure, a gap of maybe 2 inches as uplift forces tried to tear the roof free and send it sailing across the prairie. But the roof wasn't attached with simple nails or wooden pegs like traditional cabins. Thomas had used iron spikes driven through the roof beams into the wall logs, creating connections that would require tearing them wood apart to fail. The roof lifted, the iron held, the roof settled back. The pressure wave hit. This was the most insidious danger, the one most people didn't understand until it killed them. As the tornado passed, it created a rapid pressure drop. The eye of the storm had much lower pressure than the surrounding air. This drop tried to pull buildings apart from inside, like reducing the air pressure inside a sealed container. Walls wanted to bow outward. Roofs wanted to lift. Any sealed space would try to expand to equalize pressure. But Thomas's cabin wasn't sealed. The design included small ventilation gaps, carefully positioned, deliberately placed gaps that weren't large enough for wind to exploit, but allowed air pressure to equalize. As the pressure dropped outside, air flowed out through these vents, preventing the pressure differential from becoming catastrophic. The cabin groaned and creaked, but didn't explode. Wind screamed through every tiny gap in the structure. Chinking, despite being well applied, couldn't seal every microscopic crack between logs. Wind found these cracks and shrieked through them, creating whistles and wails that competed with the main roar. Dust and debris filtered inside. The air inside the cabin became hazy with suspended particles. The windows rattled but held. The small, high-mounted south windows had minimal surface area for wind pressure, and their position, protected by the deep eaves, meant much of the wind deflected over and around rather than impacting them directly. The glass flexed. Thomas could see it bowing, but didn't break. The frames, let into the log structure and reinforced with hidden bracing, didn't tear free. The door didn't move. This was perhaps the most critical test. The door, facing north, away from the wind, experienced negative pressure as air flowing around the cabin created suction on the leeward side. This tried to pull the door outward, but the design that resisted internal pressure also resisted external suction. The door stayed closed, locked, sealed. The west wall, solid logs with no windows, took enormous pressure. But with no openings to exploit, the wind simply hit solid wood and had to go around. The wall shook, the logs creaked, but there was nothing for the wind to grab, no weakness to leverage into catastrophic failure. The duration felt eternal, but was probably less than 2 minutes. 2 minutes of the cabin being hit with wind forces that would make hurricane conditions seem mild. 2 minutes of every structural element being tested to its absolute limit. 2 minutes where every decision Thomas had made, every diagonal brace, every iron spike, every carefully positioned window made the difference between survival and death. Then, with shocking suddenness, it was over. The roar diminished. The shaking stopped. The cabin settled with a sound like an exhausted sigh. Outside, the wind was still strong, probably 30 or 40 miles per hour, but it was normal wind, comprehensible wind, wind you could lean into rather than wind that could tear you apart. Thomas stood frozen for a long moment, his hands pressed against the wall, feeling the solid reality of logs that had held, of a structure that had survived what should have killed it. Then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the floor, his whole body shaking with reaction. Sarah was crying now. The children clutched against her, all 3 of them sobbing with relief and terror and shock. Michael was making a high-pitched keening sound. Anne had her face buried in her mother's dress. Sarah's eyes met Thomas's across the cabin, and what passed between them was beyond words. They were alive. Their children were alive. Their home was intact, and the knowledge of how close they'd come to death was written on both their faces. But Thomas couldn't rest, couldn't collapse, because his neighbors were out there, and some of them might still be alive. He forced himself to stand, forced his shaking legs to work. "Stay here," he told Sarah. "I need to check on the others." "You're not going out in that," Sarah said, but her protest was weak. She knew he had to go. Knew that if positions were reversed, she'd want someone to come looking for her family. "The worst has passed," Thomas said, moving to the door. "I'll be careful." He lifted the bar and pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him stole his breath. The north side of his cabin looked almost normal. Their vegetable garden was flattened, but the soil was still there, the plants just beaten down. The barn, built with the same wind-resistant principles as the cabin, still stood, though the doors had been torn off. Beyond, the cornfield showed damage, stalks bent and broken, but it was recognizably a cornfield. Thomas walked around to the south side of the cabin. The contrast was shocking, visceral, impossible to process. The land to the south looked like a different world. The topsoil was gone, stripped down to clay subsoil and in places down to bedrock. The grass wasn't just flattened, it was vanished, torn out by the roots. Small trees that had stood that morning were now stumps with torn bases, the trunks gone, carried away by wind too powerful to comprehend. And beyond, where 7 cabins had stood when the sun rose that morning, Thomas could see only debris fields. Hackett's place was simply gone. Not damaged, gone. There was no structure, no recognizable pieces, just a scatter pattern of timber fragments and household items spread across a quarter-mile of prairie. Thomas started walking toward it, his feet moving automatically while his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He found John Hackett 150 yards from where his cabin had stood. The man was lying in a shallow depression, partially buried under debris. Broken planks, shattered furniture, torn fabric that might have been clothing or bedding. Thomas pulled the debris away carefully, expecting to find a corpse. Hackett groaned. "John!" Thomas dropped to his knees beside the older man. "John, can you hear me?" Hackett's eyes opened. They were unfocused, pupils different sizes. Blood ran from his ears and nose. His left leg was bent at an angle that legs shouldn't bend. But he was alive. "Margaret," Hackett whispered, the word barely audible. "Children, where?" "I don't know yet," Thomas said. "Lie still. I'll find them." He stood and surveyed the debris field, looking for anything that might be human, alive or dead. The search took 20 minutes and revealed horrors Thomas would see in nightmares for the rest of his life. Margaret Hackett was dead. Thomas found her body pinned under a collapsed section of wall, crushed and broken. She'd died instantly when the cabin came down, probably never knew what hit her. That was a mercy, though Thomas doubted her husband would see it that way. 2 of the Hackett children were alive. James, the oldest at 11, had somehow survived with only cuts and bruises. He was in shock, sitting in the debris field, staring at nothing. Emma, age 7, had a broken arm and couldn't remember what had happened. The youngest child, 2-year-old Mary, was dead. Thomas found her body 50 yards from the cabin site, too small to have survived being thrown that distance. Thomas left James watching his sister and ran toward the Morrow place. The collapsed cabin was a pile of logs and roofing that looked impossible to search, but Thomas could hear sounds coming from inside or from under the wreckage. Moans, cries for help. "Eliza!" Thomas shouted. "Samuel! Can you hear me?" "Here." The voice was faint, muffled by tons of debris. "We're trapped. Can't." The voice broke off in coughing. Thomas started pulling at the wreckage, trying to lift logs that weighed hundreds of pounds. It was impossible, futile, but he had to try. Then he heard hoofbeats and looked up to see William Preston riding in from the northeast. Preston's claim was a mile away, far enough to have escaped the tornado's direct path, though his buildings had taken damage from the straight-line winds. "Dear God," Preston said, taking in the destruction. He dismounted and ran to help Thomas. Together, they started lifting and shifting logs, working their way into the collapsed structure. They could hear voices inside, multiple people trapped but alive. It took 40 minutes to create an opening. Eliza Morrow emerged first, covered in blood from scalp wounds, but moving under her own power. 3 of her 4 children came out behind her, bruised, terrified, but alive. The cabin's collapse had created a pocket of space where they'd sheltered, the debris forming a protective cage rather than crushing them. But Samuel Morrow wasn't with them. "He was outside," Eliza said, her voice flat with shock. "Saw the storm. Ran to get the animals out of the pen. I didn't see. After the cabin fell, I couldn't see anything." They found Samuel Morrow a quarter-mile from his collapsed cabin, lying in torn prairie grass that was turning red with his blood. His body was broken in ways that defied description. Every limb bent wrong, ribs visibly crushed, skull fractured and bleeding. But impossibly, he was still breathing. "Don't move me," Samuel whispered when Thomas and Preston reached him. "I can feel," he coughed, blood bubbling from his lips. "Feel everything broken inside." "We're getting you help," Thomas said, though he knew there wasn't help for injuries this severe. Not out here, not with the nearest doctor 2 days away in Independence. "My family?" Samuel asked. "Alive," Thomas told him. "Eliza and 3 of the children got out. They're safe." Samuel closed his eyes. Told you to build that way. Should have listened." Blood ran from his nose. "Should have." His breath stopped. His chest rose once more, fell, and didn't rise again. Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at the body. Samuel Morrow had been 32 years old, healthy and strong, a good man trying to build a life for his family. He'd died because he'd built his cabin the way he'd been taught, the way every building manual said to build, the way tradition demanded. He'd died doing everything right by European standards and everything wrong by the standards of the land he'd tried to settle. The next hours were a blur of searching, treating injuries with inadequate supplies, and taking stock of losses. Of 7 settler families in that section of prairie, 12 people were dead outright, and 2 more were injured badly enough that they likely wouldn't survive the week. 23 people had survived, many with injuries ranging from minor to severe. 5 cabins were completely destroyed. 2 others had suffered catastrophic damage that made them uninhabitable. Only Thomas's cabin stood essentially undamaged. By nightfall, the survivors had gathered at Thomas's place because there was nowhere else to go. Sarah cooked what food they had: cornmeal, dried venison, preserved vegetables from the previous year's harvest. Thomas broke out his emergency supplies, the stores he'd put aside for exactly this kind of disaster. People sat in shocked silence, processing trauma too fresh to understand, too overwhelming to accept. Children whimpered. Women stared at nothing. Men who'd lost everything they owned tried to plan rebuilding efforts while their eyes kept unfocusing, their minds unable to hold complex thoughts.
The Morrow children sat together in a corner, orphaned now. Their mother had died 2 hours after being pulled from the wreckage, internal injuries finally claiming her. Their father was already gone. As darkness fell and people tried to settle for an uncomfortable night, too many bodies in too small a space, John Hackett spoke. He was lying on Thomas's bed, his shattered legs splintered with boards salvaged from what used to be his own cabin. His face was gray with
Pain and grief. His wife was dead. His youngest child was dead. His home was gone. He'd lost everything except his 2 surviving children and his own broken body. "Why?" he asked, his voice cutting through the muted conversations and quiet weeping. "Why did your cabin stand when all of ours fell?" The question hung in the air. Everyone stopped talking. All eyes turned to Thomas, standing near the fireplace, exhausted and hollow. He'd spent hours searching debris, pulling bodies from wreckage, trying to help people who couldn't be helped. He wanted to say something diplomatic, something that wouldn't make it sound like he'd known his neighbors would die and had done nothing to prevent it. But Sarah spoke first. Her voice was sharp, angry in a way Thomas had rarely heard. "Because he listened," she said. "When 3 hawks told him to build for the wind instead of the sun, he listened. When an Osage elder who'd lived on this land for 60 years said the cabins should face away from the prevailing storms, he listened. And you all mocked him for it." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Pride and survival instinct wrestled in the minds of men who'd spent 2 years laughing at Thomas's backward cabin. The cabin that had just saved his family while their own properly built, correctly oriented structures had killed their wives, their children, their neighbors. "I didn't know," Hackett said finally. "How could I have known?" "You were told," Sarah replied, and her voice was cold as winter iron. "We all were. The Osage people who lived here, who've survived these storms for hundreds of years, they told us. They warned us. They offered to teach. And we, you, dismissed them. Called their knowledge primitive, said they didn't understand real building techniques. Now look where we are." Thomas put a hand on his wife's shoulder, gentling her. "The door faces north," he said quietly, "away from the prevailing wind. When the tornado hit, there was no opening for wind to get inside and blow the structure apart from within. The south wall, the wall that took the direct hit, has only small windows positioned high and protected by deep eaves. It's the strongest part of the cabin, designed to take impact without failing. The bracing pattern distributes force across multiple structural members instead of concentrating stress at critical joints. The foundation anchors prevent the entire structure from lifting off and disintegrating in the air." He paused, looking around at the faces watching him, some grieving, some angry, all exhausted beyond measure. "It's not traditional European carpentry. The books I learned from don't teach this. The builders I worked with back in Tennessee would think I was insane. But this isn't Tennessee. This isn't Europe. The rules are different here. The storms are different here. What works back east will kill you on the prairie." William Preston, who'd helped dig the Morrows out and who'd seen what the tornado did to traditionally built structures, spoke up. "You tried to tell us. I remember. Last year when Morrow was building, You suggested he face it differently. He thought you were touched." "We all did," another man said. Fletcher, whose cabin had survived only because it was north of the tornado's path, not because it was well built, "thought you were being contrary, or showing off that you knew Indians." "Three Hawks isn't just an Indian," Thomas said, and there was steel in his voice now. "He's an engineer. Not by European standards, not with formal education, but he understands how wind works, how structures fail, how to build for survival in conditions most of us have never experienced. His people have lived through thousands of these storms. They've learned what works through trial and error spanning generations. That knowledge is valuable. That knowledge saves lives, and we've been too proud to recognize it." Samuel Morrow, despite his injuries and exhaustion, spoke from where he sat wrapped in blankets near the fire. "My brother's dead, Samuel. He died because I built his cabin wrong. Built it the way I knew was right, the way my father taught me, the way we've always built. And it killed him just as sure as if I'd pushed him in front of that tornado." "You didn't know," Thomas started to say, but Morrow cut him off. "I did know. You told me. Warned me about orientation, about bracing. I didn't listen because," his voice broke, "because I thought I knew better. Thought Pennsylvania methods were superior to Indian wisdom. Thought tradition was more valuable than observation." Tears tracked through the dirt on his face. "My pride killed my brother." No one spoke. What could be said? The truth was too raw, too immediate. These people had just learned through blood and death that their cultural assumptions were wrong, their building traditions inadequate, their pride catastrophically misplaced. The lesson couldn't have been more brutal or more clear. Over the following weeks, as survivors rebuilt, every single cabin went up facing north. Not because someone wrote a building code, not because the territorial government mandated it, not because any authority figure told them to. They did it because 12 people were dead and 23 people were alive, and the difference came down to which way the door faced. Thomas helped with the rebuilding, showed them the bracing patterns Three Hawks had taught him, demonstrated the proper roof pitch, explained the foundation anchoring and why iron hardware was expensive but worth every penny. Some men accepted the instruction with gratitude, desperate to learn anything that might prevent another disaster. Others accepted it with resentment, hating that they needed knowledge from Indians filtered through a man they'd mocked. But they all built facing north. They all minimized south and west window openings. They all used diagonal bracing. Because the alternative was written in shattered timbers and shallow graves. The story spread far beyond that isolated section of Missouri prairie. Travelers passing through asked about the disaster, heard about the one cabin that survived, came to examine Thomas's place with the intensity of engineers studying a bridge that hadn't collapsed. Some adopted the changes, many didn't, old habits and cultural pride being what they are. But in the settlements that sprouted across tornado-prone regions over the following decades, a quiet revolution in frontier architecture took place. Builders who'd survived severe storms began sharing knowledge about what worked. Men who'd lost families in collapsed cabins built their second attempts with obsessive attention to wind resistance. Women who'd buried children became fierce advocates for different building practices, wielding their grief as social pressure that overcame male stubbornness. Children who'd lived through disasters grew up with intuitive understanding of why orientation mattered, why bracing patterns mattered, why every architectural decision could mean life or death. By the 1860s and 1870s, certain regional patterns had emerged. In western Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma territories, the heart of what would later be called Tornado Alley, cabin orientation had largely shifted away from traditional south-facing design. North-facing structures became common enough that travelers from eastern states noticed and commented on the peculiar building practices. The architectural details revealed sophisticated understanding that went beyond simple orientation. Roof pitches converged toward that 30-degree angle Three Hawks had demonstrated to Thomas. Window patterns showed consistent minimization of western and southern openings. Foundation techniques evolved to include deeper anchoring and mechanical connections rather than relying on weight alone. Storm cellars, initially rare on the prairie due to the labor required to excavate them, became standard features. These weren't simple root cellars. They were dedicated survival structures, separate from primary dwellings, specifically engineered to withstand direct tornado strikes. The designs borrowed heavily from indigenous pit house and earth lodge construction, though settlers rarely acknowledged the source. The community of Codell, Kansas, provided a dramatic example of knowledge transfer. Hit by tornadoes on May 20th, 3 years running, 1916, 1917, and 1918, the town became obsessive about storm-resistant construction. After the third strike, community leaders implemented informal building codes that specified foundation depths, bracing requirements, window placement, and orientation guidelines. Structures built after 1918 using these standards survived subsequent tornadoes at dramatically higher rates than older buildings. The meteorological understanding of why orientation mattered wasn't formally studied until the late 19th century, but the practical knowledge was sound. Tornadoes in the Great Plains form within supercell thunderstorms that develop when warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico collides with cold, dry air from the continental interior. The rotation that creates tornadoes is initiated by wind shear, different wind speeds and directions at different altitudes. This meteorological setup occurs most reliably when storms move from southwest to northeast, following the track of the jet stream and the boundaries between air masses. A structure with large openings facing southwest presents maximum vulnerability to the most common tornado approach. The wind doesn't just blow against the south wall, it finds doors and windows and floods inside, creating internal pressure that tries to explode the structure from within. Rotating the building 180 degrees and facing primary openings northeast doesn't eliminate danger, but it reduces the probability of catastrophic wind penetration by positioning the strongest, most solid walls toward the most likely storm approach. The structural engineering principles were equally sound, though they wouldn't be formally analyzed until the 20th century. Wind loading on buildings creates complex force patterns: positive pressure pushing, negative pressure pulling, uplift trying to separate roof from walls, lateral forces trying to rack the structure into parallelogram shapes, torsional forces from asymmetric loading trying to twist buildings apart. Traditional timber frame construction, with its reliance on simple right-angle joints, was strong in compression but weak in tension and shear, exactly wrong for wind loading. The diagonal bracing Three Hawks taught Thomas created triangulated structural systems inherently resistant to deformation. A rectangle can be pushed into a parallelogram without breaking any member. The angles change while the sides stay the same length. A triangle cannot change shape without changing the length of its sides, which requires either breaking or stretching the material. By creating a structural cage of interconnected triangles, the cabin gained rigidity that simple beam and post construction couldn't match. The foundation anchoring addressed the single most catastrophic failure mode in tornado damage: complete structural uplift. Extreme winds generate tremendous upward force. The Bernoulli effect, faster moving air having lower pressure, creates suction over roofs. The uplift force on even a small building can exceed its weight by large margins. Without mechanical anchoring, structures simply rise off foundations and disintegrate in the air. The iron spikes Thomas used, driven through foundation logs into rock, created positive connections that had to be broken rather than just overcome by weight. The physics of internal pressure was perhaps the most sophisticated concept, one that modern wind engineering considers critical, but that most 19th century builders didn't understand. When wind penetrates a building envelope through any opening, a broken window, a compromised door, a gap in construction, it increases internal pressure. That pressure seeks escape through any available opening. Doors designed to resist external pressure but not internal pressure blow outward. Once the door fails, the pressure differential between inside and outside becomes even more extreme, and the entire structure can fail catastrophically in seconds. Thomas's door, reinforced to resist pressure from both directions, prevented this failure cascade. The ventilation gaps he'd built in, too small for wind to exploit meaningfully, but large enough to allow pressure equalization, prevented dangerous pressure differentials from developing. The structure could breathe without being penetrated. The cultural transmission of this knowledge, or rather, the failure of cultural transmission, is the uncomfortable heart of the story. Three Hawks wasn't unique or special among his people. The Osage, like virtually all Great Plains tribes, had sophisticated understanding of storm behavior and wind-resistant construction. This knowledge was offered to settlers repeatedly in many places, in many ways, sometimes through direct teaching, as Three Hawks taught Thomas. Sometimes through example, settlers who paid attention noticed that indigenous structures in certain locations survived storms that destroyed everything around them. Sometimes through explicit warnings, tribal members telling settlers not to build in particular locations or in particular ways because the storms would destroy them. The knowledge was available. The tragedy is how rarely it was accepted. European settlers arrived with assumptions of cultural and technological superiority that made it psychologically difficult to accept that primitive peoples might know valuable things that civilized cultures didn't. The cognitive dissonance of simultaneously believing Native Americans were inferior while depending on their knowledge for survival was typically resolved by denying the debt or claiming the knowledge was obvious or common sense that anyone would discover on their own. This pattern of appropriation without acknowledgement extended far beyond building techniques. Native American agricultural innovations, including the Three Sisters planting method that sustained settler communities when European monoculture farming failed on prairie soils, medicinal knowledge that saved lives from diseases and injuries frontier doctors couldn't treat, food preservation techniques that prevented starvation during harsh winters, fire management practices that maintained prairie health and prevented catastrophic wildfires, water management, hunting techniques, seasonal migration patterns, weather prediction, and countless other domains where indigenous knowledge systems were more sophisticated than European alternatives for frontier conditions. The frontier was settled not primarily through European ingenuity, but through massive transfer of indigenous knowledge, most of it unacknowledged and uncredited. The rugged individualist pioneer overcoming wilderness through superior will and intelligence is mythology that requires forgetting who the real teachers were. Thomas Brennan was unusual only in that he listened and he credited his source. When people asked how he'd known to build his cabin facing north, he told them, "An Osage elder named Three Hawks taught me." He didn't claim it was his own innovation. He didn't say he'd figured it out through clever observation. He gave credit where credit was due, though that honesty made some neighbors uncomfortable. It was easier to believe a white settler had discovered the right methods than to acknowledge debt to an indigenous teacher. Three Hawks died in 1868 on reservation land in Oklahoma where the Osage had been relocated. Thomas visited him twice in those final years, making the difficult journey to bring gifts: tobacco, fabric, iron, tools, and news from the prairie they'd both known when it was less settled. The old man was pleased to hear that settlers had adopted the building methods he'd shared, though unsurprised that his name was rarely attached to them. "The wind doesn't care who gets credit," Three Hawks said on that last visit, sitting outside a canvas tent because even the government-built houses on the reservation were poorly designed for prairie conditions. "The wind only cares whether you were wise enough to listen." Thomas had nodded, understanding that Three Hawks was talking about more than building techniques. He was talking about the fundamental question of how knowledge is created and shared, who is recognized as holding expertise, and what happens when cultural arrogance prevents learning from those who have more experience. "I tried to get them to listen earlier," Thomas said, "before the tornado. I told Hackett, told Morrow, told all of them. They didn't believe me." "They didn't believe me either," Three Hawks replied. "When I was young, when more of my people still lived on that prairie, we warned settlers, told them where storms walked, how to build to survive. Some listened, most didn't. The land taught them. The land always teaches, but the price is high." 12 people died because they wouldn't listen to you. Three Hawks shook his head. "They died because they thought their way was the only way, because they confused tradition with truth. Tradition is how your people survived in one place, but tradition from one place kills you in another place. This is hard lesson. Your people learn it slowly, with much dying." The conversation stayed with Thomas for the rest of his life. He thought about it every time he helped someone build a cabin, every time someone asked about orientation and bracing. He thought about it when his own children grew up and built their own homes, automatically incorporating the wind-resistant principles he'd taught them. He thought about it when travelers from eastern states stopped at his farm and asked why his buildings looked wrong. Doors on the north side, minimal western windows, asymmetric designs that violated aesthetic principles. "They're built for the land," he'd say, "not for tradition, not for how things look, for the land and the weather and the storms that will come whether we're ready or not." Thomas's cabin stood for 43 years. He added to it as his family grew: a second room in 1856, a proper kitchen in 1862, a sleeping loft in 1867. Every addition followed the same principles Three Hawks had taught him. When he finally built the larger house in 1876, he oriented it north-facing, used diagonal bracing that by then had become his signature style, and over-engineered the foundation, anchoring with iron hardware that was by then more readily available. The old cabin became a storage building, then a workshop, then finally a museum of sorts for Thomas's grandchildren, the place where Grandpa had survived the great tornado, the building that proved unusual methods could be right even when everyone said they were wrong. Thomas died in 1889, aged 67, in the larger house he'd built using principles learned from an Osage elder 4 decades earlier. His obituary in the Independence newspaper called him a skilled carpenter and survivor of the 1853 tornado disaster. It didn't mention Three Hawks. The knowledge had been absorbed into Thomas Brennan's building methods, the indigenous source erased from the story. But the structures remained. Thomas's original cabin stood until 1929, when it was finally demolished to make room for a modern farmhouse. The builders noted the unusual features: the diagonal bracing that seemed excessive, the foundation anchoring that seemed paranoid, the door orientation that seemed backward. They didn't understand why these features existed. The knowledge had been professionalized and coded in building codes and engineering standards that didn't explain their origins. Three Hawks' legacy lives in structures, not written records. The building techniques he shared influenced frontier architecture across the Great Plains, saving countless lives in storms that would have been catastrophic otherwise. But his name doesn't appear in architectural histories. He's not credited in engineering texts. He exists in a few journal entries and letters mentioned briefly as an Indian elder or a native guide who provided useful information, his name often not recorded. This erasure isn't unique. It's the pattern of how frontier knowledge was transferred and credit was withheld. The innovations that allowed westward expansion succeeded were often indigenous innovations that European settlers adopted while claiming them as their own discoveries. For modern readers, the lesson extends beyond tornado-resistant architecture. It's about recognizing expertise in forms that don't match our cultural expectations. Sophisticated knowledge exists in oral traditions, practical demonstrations, experiential learning, not just in written texts and formal education. People without formal training can possess deeper expertise in specific domains than credentialed professionals. Cultural prejudice blinds us to valuable knowledge, and that blindness costs lives. The physics that saved Thomas's cabin remains valid. Wind behavior hasn't changed. Structural mechanics are eternal. The principles of building for survival in hostile environments are timeless. What changes is whether we're humble enough to learn from those who figured things out before us, regardless of whether they fit our assumptions about expertise. When that tornado hit on May 17, 1853, It killed people who'd done everything right by European standards and spared those who'd done everything right by indigenous standards. The wind didn't care about cultural superiority, building traditions, or pride. It only cared about physics.
The cabin built on indigenous principles stood. The cabins built on European tradition fell. That's not ideology. That's not opinion. That's what happened when theory met reality and reality won. The prairie is still there, still flat, still dangerous, still testing everyone who tries to live on it. Modern construction methods are far superior to anything available in 1853. Materials are stronger, connections more robust, analysis more sophisticated, building codes enforced. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. Build for the environment you're actually in, not the environment you came from. Understand local conditions. Learn from those who survived there longer than you have. And never assume your way is the only way or the best way just because it's the way you were taught. That assumption killed 12 people in Missouri in 1853. It's killed countless others across the frontier in circumstances ranging from architecture to agriculture to medicine to navigation.
And it continues killing people today whenever arrogance prevents learning from available expertise. The north-facing cabin stands as testament not to one man's ingenuity, but to the value of listening when someone offers knowledge, regardless of whether they match your expectations of what a teacher should look like. Three Hawks knew how to survive prairie storms. He offered that knowledge to anyone willing to learn. Thomas Brennan listened. That made all the difference. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier histories. Thanks for exploring Western Pioneer Archives with us.